The Nuremberg executions that were carried out on the remaining members of Hitler's government who had been condemned for their war crimes and crimes against humanity are often considered very botched today. The executioner John C. Woods was an American army hangman who obtained the position under rather controversial circumstances, shall we say, and inside of Nuremberg Prison's gymnasium, his lack of experience and skill led to lengthy executions, but the US forces intended the proceedings to be quick. Woods would later defend himself, saying that he thought he did a good job, but the most botched of the executions saw a virulent close associate of Adolf Hitler being sent through the trapdoor of the gallows. But John C. Woods then had to finish off Julius Streicher, disappearing behind the curtain of the execution structure and then pulling down on his body. But Streicher himself was a terrifying and brutal man, and he was someone who went to his death as staunch a supporter of Hitler than he'd ever been. But what happened with Julius Streicher's execution and what were his crimes? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Julius Streicher was born on the 12th of February 1885 inside of the Kingdom of Bavaria, and he worked as a schoolteacher in his early life. He was married and had 2 sons, but in 1914, as the First World War broke out in Europe, he joined the German army. He was well decorated, receiving the Iron Cross first and second class, and he was also commissioned as an officer, but his behaviour in the military was known at times to have been rather poor. As the end of the conflict came around, Streicher was demobilised, and he returned to civilian life, resuming his teaching career, but around the year 1919, something happened, and he became incredibly anti-Semitic and discriminatory towards certain members of the German population at the time. He became very influenced by other similar thinkers, and Streicher first got involved in political activism, becoming a member of the Deutsche Völkischer Schutz- und Trutzbund, a nationalist organisation that came around in opposition to communism. These groups became notorious in their virulent ideas and ideologies, and Streicher remained in the group for years, but in September 1922, he then formally joined the Nazi Party, a fledgling political party based in Bavaria, where Streicher was from. He had witnessed Adolf Hitler speak, and from that moment on, he had some form of obsession with the man who would later become the Führer. Specifically, Streicher said about the moment he first saw Hitler that, and I quote, "It was on a winter's day in 1922. I sat unknown in a large hall of the Bürgerbrau house. Suspense was in the air. Everyone seemed tense with excitement, with anticipation. Then suddenly a shout, 'Hitler is coming.' Thousands of men and women jumped to their feet as if propelled by a mysterious power. They shouted, 'Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler,' and he then stood on the podium. Then I knew that in this Adolf Hitler was someone extraordinary. He was one who could wrestle out the German spirit and the German heart, the power to break the chains of slavery. Yes, yes, this man spoke as a messenger from heaven at a time when the gates of hell were opening to pull everything down. And when he finally finished, and while the crowd raised the roof with singing of the Deutschland song, I rushed to the stage." From that moment on, Julius Streicher was devoted to serve Hitler in whatever way he could. He formed in May 1923 the anti-Semitic sensationalist newspaper known as Der Sturmer, and in this he would for many years terrify the public with depictions of people who were being persecuted, which would propagate the views of the Nazis and lead to persecution inside of Germany. He was also present at the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed revolution, and marched on the front row of this. Streicher was suspended from teaching, but his loyalty to Hitler continued to grow, and the pair became very good friends. Hitler throughout his life and time as dictator would actually back Streicher over others, and he remained very loyal to him. But Der Sturmer, his newspaper, continued to rise and grow into a national publication, and Streicher was also in control of a number of regional positions within the Nazi Party. He was extreme in what he wrote and published, but Hitler even allowed Der Sturmer to be posted for public reading inside special display cases in German cities and towns. In July 1932, Streicher became a deputy of the Reichstag, and after the Nazis' seizure of power, he ordered a boycott of Jewish businesses, and was even known as the King of Nuremberg or the Beast of Franconia. Streicher was someone not to be messed with, especially as he was a Gauleiter, a Nazi regional leader. He even had the Grand Synagogue of Nuremberg destroyed in 1938, as he deemed it architecturally offensive. Despite being a prominent member of the Nazi Party in the early days, as the Second World War came around, his power decreased and waned over time. Hitler still was loyal to Streicher, but his behaviour was seen as incredibly irresponsible and possibly damaging to other members of the Nazi government because he was referred to as the worst of the anti-Semites. He was somewhat embarrassing in the eyes of the other Nazi members of government, and he did have a number of enemies within Hitler's inner circle, including the incredibly influential and powerful Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. Göring in particular became a figure of ridicule inside of Der Sturmer for Streicher, and he published scandalous untrue stories claiming that Göring's daughter was conceived by artificial insemination and that he was not the true father of his daughter Edda. Göring understandably was furious at this, and he went straight to Hitler with other members of the Nazi Party and accused Streicher of many things, including even walking through the streets of Nuremberg, cracking a bullwhip at people. For this he was sent to trial in front of the Supreme Party Court, and Streicher was judged to have been unsuitable for leadership, and in February 1940, Julius Streicher was stripped of his party offices, and he was then sent into the shadows. He continued to quietly publish his newspaper Der Stürmer, and Hitler, despite his fall from grace, remained a close and loyal friend to him. But as the Second World War came to an end, Julius Streicher was arrested, and he had decided not to take his own life, but to instead try his hand at surviving a death sentence in front of a courtroom full of judges. He had been captured in Austria by American forces, and alongside many other former high-ranking Nazis, Julius Streicher was taken to the Nuremberg trials to answer for the crimes of the Nazi Party and for the Holocaust. He tried to claim that he had been tortured and mistreated by Allied soldiers following his capture, and it was found that he had the lowest IQ of all of the Nuremberg defendants. He was not involved in the Second World War, and he also did not take part in the planning of the Holocaust, despite being an outspoken advocate of it. For this he was found guilty of the final charge of crimes against humanity, with his outspoken rhetoric and publishing bringing about the suffering of so many people. The majority of the evidence against him came from his own newspaper and in speeches he had made across Germany, and he was deemed someone who was incredibly incendiary and who could whip up a crowd to persecute others. And he was seen as guilty as those who even ordered the extermination of the Jews. The judgment against him stated that, and I quote, "For his 25 years of speaking, writing and preaching hatred of the Jews, Streicher was widely known as Jew-baiter number one. In his speeches and articles week after week, month after month, he infected the German mind with the virus of anti-Semitism and incited the German people to active persecution. Streicher's incitement to murder and extermination at the time when Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes, as defined by the Charter, and constitutes a crime against humanity." He was, as mentioned, sentenced to death for his crimes, and in the early hours of the 16th of October 1946, he was taken into Nuremberg Prison's execution chamber for his date with American executioner and hangman John C. Woods. Woods was making a mess of the proceedings, and by using an ill-fitted gallows and his own mistakes, the Nuremberg Nazis were taking many minutes to die. Death should have been relatively instantaneous, but this was far from the case. The gallows also did not allow the condemned to fall through well, and the trapdoor even smashed some of them on the head as they went crashing through. Streicher's execution was witnessed by a number inside of the chamber, and it was stated of his execution by an eyewitness that Julius Streicher made his melodramatic appearance at 2:12 a.m. While his manacles were being removed and his bare hands bound, this ugly, dwarfish little man, wearing a threadbare suit and a well-worn bluish shirt, buttoned to the neck but without a tie, he was notorious during his days of power for his flashy dress, glanced at the three wooden scaffolds rising menacingly in front of him. Then he glanced around the room, his eyes resting momentarily upon the small group of witnesses. By the time his hands were tied securely behind his back, two guards, one on each arm, directed him to number 1 gallows, on the left of the entrance. He walked steadily the 6 feet to the first wooden step, but his face was twitching. As the guards stopped him at the bottom of the steps for identification formalities, he uttered his piercing scream, "Heil Hitler!" The shriek sent a shiver down my back. As its echo died away, an American colonel standing by the steps said sharply, "Ask the man his name." In response to the interpreter's query, Streicher shouted, "You know my name well." The interpreter repeated his request, and the condemned man yelled, "Julius Streicher." As he reached the platform, Streicher cried out, "Now it goes to God." He was pushed the last 2 steps to the mortal spot beneath the hangman's rope. The rope was being held back against a wooden rail by the hangman. Streicher was swung suddenly to face the witnesses and glared at them. Suddenly he screamed, "Purim Fest 1946. Purim is a Jewish holiday celebrated in the spring, commemorating the execution of Haman, ancient persecutor of the Jews, described in the Old Testament. The American officer standing at the scaffold said, "Ask the man if he has any last words." When the interpreter had translated, Streicher shouted, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day." When the black hood was raised over his head, Streicher's muffled voice could be heard to say, "Adele, my dear wife." At that instant the trap opened with a loud bang. He went down kicking. When the rope snapped taut with the body swinging wildly, groans could be heard from within the concealed interior of the scaffold. Finally the hangman, who had descended from the gallows platform, lifted the black canvas curtain and went inside. Something happened that put a stop to the groans and brought the rope to a standstill. After it was over, I was not in the mood to ask what he did, but I assumed that he grabbed the swinging body and pulled down on it. We were all of the opinion that Streicher had been strangled. So Julius Streicher had gone through the gallows and had not been instantly killed. The executioner then went behind the curtain of the gallows and pulled down on his body, with John C. Woods finishing him off. His remains were then cremated, and the ashes of one of the most virulent and brutal Nazis were scattered in the Isar River. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.